Welcome back to Brandon Wilborn's Fantasy Fiction Podcast, where fans of classic fantasy adventures can hear the serialized audiobooks of a fellow nerd and indie author completely for free. I'm your author, narrator, and host, Brandon Wilborn. Thank you for listening today. The story portion of this episode starts right after a brief recap. Last week in the Treasure of Capric, Kurian's group learned that the soldiers were hot on their trail, but they had enough warning from Louise to prepare for a fight. We'll see how that plays out today. Also last week, back at Pollingham, Muna got more of her hooks into Captain Fallon, and it was pretty creepy. This week we'll be reading from Chapter 8. Following that, a brief morsel of wisdom. Now I present for your enjoyment, The Treasure of Capric. Chapter 8. Battle of the Apple Grove. Kurian watched from beneath a pile of leaves as Noeman poked at the fire with a dry stick. The dean sat near the center of the grove of trees where they had camped the night before, with Greta tied to the nearest tree. He had covered his robes with a blanket. It wasn't a perfect disguise, but he could easily be confused for someone trying to escape a dying village like Apiford. When the riders left, they had decided quickly that confronting the pursuers was their only option. If they had been tracked across the plain, then they could not run fast enough to escape. Kurian had proposed an ambush, and Tobin had immediately offered a plan. Now Louise hid behind Noeman in her original place, while the boys hid beneath leaves that had naturally piled up against the tree trunks at the south end of the grove. With luck, the riders would approach the dean, leaving their backs exposed. At first it felt cold and damp, but the longer they waited for the riders to return, the warmer Kurian's hiding place became. The leaf pile smelled of rot and mold, stifling his breath. As the fog lifted, steam rose even from the piles that weren't hiding anyone, making them excellent camouflage. Now, they waited. Kurian had felt the nerves of an impending attack during his training, but he had always known that nobody would be seriously hurt. Waiting in ambush for real enemies made him feel jittery. It wasn't the intense energy he had felt after fighting Captain Fallon. It was the expectation of that feeling. Except that now the odds were less in their favor. The ambush made him feel more confident, while also feeling more afraid for the outcome. Once they sprang from hiding, there was no controlling the results. He understood Rhys's love for the fight, the eagerness for struggle, but in his own heart he also feared the danger. He loved and hated the creeping vibrations that started in his belly and worked out toward his limbs. Carefully, he turned his head to look toward the plains. Waiting without moving for almost 2 hours was becoming painful. The fog had burned off an hour before, and he could see for at least a half-mile now. It was unlikely that the day would clear much more. With his body pressed to the ground, he felt the horses coming before he saw them. After several minutes of steady hoofbeats, they came into view one by one. 7. 2 more than he had counted that morning. Kurian's heart suddenly boomed in his chest. They rode spread out in a line, their heads moving to scan the ground before them. He saw now that they were dressed in the uniforms of the guards he had seen in Downriver Town. Each wore a tunic covered with a heavy jerkin of dark leather and a studded cap. Riding in the center of the line, their leader wore a mail shirt and a brimmed helmet. As they passed his hiding place, Kurian saw that the leader carried a long sword, while his men had short swords and daggers. This wasn't going to be anything like Siege Week at the compound. "Good day," called the leader to Noeman. Kurian recognized his voice from that morning. He turned his head again to watch them walk into the trap and waited for Noeman's signal. The guards brought their horses together in a small semicircle around the dean's fire. It was a poor formation for defense. God might finally be in their favor today. Noeman waved a hand at them, but kept silent. "Are you traveling alone, old man?" "No," Noeman answered. "I have my pony." He gestured at Greta. The guard dismounted from his horse and walked over to where Greta was tied. "And how long have you had this pony?" he asked as he looked over the bags tied to her back. "Not long. I lost everything. So I gathered what I could to find a new home." "We've been tracking 3 young men and a woman across the plain. They also have a pony." He picked up one of Greta's hoofs and studied it. "You haven't seen anybody, have you?" Noeman shook his head. "I saw the trees and decided to stop to warm myself with a fire. Haven't had fresh apples in a long time, either. You should try one." Kurian thought he could hear the dean's voice waver. He wasn't accustomed to deception, and it went against everything he taught. "You said you lost everything." Noeman nodded and looked down. "Fire," he grunted. "Seems you were able to gather quite a lot," the guard said innocently. "God provides." Noeman poked at the fire again with his stick. "This is a puzzle." The guard scratched his chin. "You say you're traveling alone, and that you only just got this pony. But we've rode all around this part of the plains this morning, and there's only one set of pony tracks leading up to this place." Kurian's muscles started to burn. The guard knew Noeman was lying, and they needed to attack now if they were to have surprise on their side. Noeman stared at his interrogator. "I don't know who you are, but I don't believe your story." "Maybe you mixed up trails somewhere," Noeman said. "Or maybe those other people moved on from here." The dean looked nervous, even from a distance. He needed to give the signal soon. "I think maybe you stole that pony from some poor soul, and a patrol of guards makes you nervous." The man crossed his arms, standing over Noeman. "That's ridiculous." The guard leaned further over Noeman. "But it's your lucky day. I'm after those other four, and I don't have time to drag you in. I might confiscate your pony, but it'd just slow me down." "What are you going to do, then?" the dean asked. "I'm going to let you go," said the guard. Kurian saw the dean relax. "As long as you give me anything valuable you might be carrying." "You'd take everything from an old man?" The dean seemed appalled at the very concept, more than being personally affronted. "Gold, silver, copper, whatever you've got. Consider it a discount on justice." His men laughed. "You're a pack of wolves," Noeman shouted, waving his stick at the guard. Then he gave the signal and threw the stick into the fire. The small fire exploded with a flash of flame and smoke from the monk's powder that had also been in his hand. The horses screamed and reared, throwing 3 of the guards to the ground. The leader tried to jump back, and Noeman knocked him over with a kick to the knee. When Kurian, Rhys, and Tobin leapt from their hiding places in a cloud of leaves, the remaining riders wheeled about in panic. Smoke continued to billow from the fire, pouring out in every direction and obscuring the entire grove. "What magic is this?" shouted the mounted guard to Kurian's right, and drew his sword. Rhys thrust his staff at him and knocked him off his horse. The middle horse bolted, and Rhys swung his staff again, flipping the rider over its tail. The man landed on his head with a loud crack. Kurian rushed forward, trailing leaves, and smashed the knob of his staff against the head of a man on the ground. Another guard was trying to draw his sword, even though he was still laying on it. Kurian jabbed at him with the pointed end of his staff. It pierced the leather jerkin, and the man screamed and fell limp on his back. Seeing the blood made Kurian stop. The sound of fighting around him faded, as if he were going deaf. His body suddenly felt heavy. His stomach churned and he was dizzy. He had drawn blood before, but it had always been one of the hazards of training, never on purpose. It was only scrapes and sprains. None of his friends were ever injured. He turned to look at the first man he had hit. A dimple in the leather cap told him he was probably dead too. Smoke washed over the body, blocking him from view. After preparing to defend his order in battle for 10 years, he had now killed 2 men in seconds and realized how little prepared he was for bringing death. He fell to his knees and vomited. The third grounded man had now gained his feet and rushed toward Kurian's back with his weapon raised. As he swung, Tobin jumped out from the smoke and parried with his staff, then swung back at the man with a ferocity that Kurian had never seen from him before. Pushing the man back with every swing, Tobin ended up fighting beside Rhys against the man he had unhorsed. Only their torsos were visible in the thick smoke from the powder, making them appear to float as they battled with the guards. One man remained on horseback. Kurian watched as his horse wheeled, and he surveyed the situation. He didn't see Kurian kneeling in the smoke. Finally, the guard drew his sword and prepared to charge toward Rhys and Tobin, still fighting with his comrades. Coming to his senses, Kurian picked up his staff and swung wildly as the horse sped by. He saw the rider fall back into the fire, but the horse's flank slammed into Kurian, knocking him to the side. When he stood up, the guard was almost on top of him with a naked blade and flames leaping from his back. The padded cloth of his shirt seemed to be protecting him. "You're on fire!" Kurian yelled. The guard turned to look and began beating himself with his free hand. Then Kurian swung his staff and flinched when it thumped into the distracted man's head. When he turned, Rhys and Tobin stood together, looking for other threats. Noeman had drawn the dagger from his boot and was wrestling on the ground with the leader of the guards. While the dean had caught them by surprise, the leader fought with a calm precision that his men did not have. He threw Noeman against a tree and took the opportunity to arm himself. Behind him, he didn't see Louise creeping out of her hiding spot. She swung Noeman's staff at his legs, buckling one knee. He crumpled to the ground, and Noeman jumped forward with his dagger. Kurian looked around him at the dead guards appearing through the rapidly dissipating cloud. His throat felt closed off. He couldn't breathe until violent sobs racked his body and his feet carried him stumbling from the grove. He was glad it wasn't Noeman who came to him first. Tobin approached slowly and waited a moment before sitting down next to where he had fallen. Kurian didn't look at him. He lay on his side, staring over the grass. Tobin sat in silence for several minutes before placing his hand on Kurian's head. "It hurts," Tobin finally said. Kurian did not answer, but he sat up and looked at his friend. "I imagine it will fade." "They were going to leave," Kurian said after a long pause. "Maybe," Tobin nodded. "But how long would it have taken them to catch our trail again? They might have set their own ambush ahead of us, or pulled back just out of sight and waited for us to reveal ourselves. You remember the blacksmith's reminder, 'Attack no man if it be in your power.' We could never avoid this fight, or one like it." "I killed 2 of them without a struggle. They were just lying on the ground." Kurian felt warm tears streaming down his face. "It didn't feel like defense. It felt like murder." "We know who sent them, and what he intends," Tobin said firmly. There was a stern resolve in the look he gave Kurian. "His actions have already proved that he is a dangerous threat. What we did fulfills our oaths to protect our brothers from harm and gets us closer to reclaiming the treasure." Kurian felt a pain in his chest over his heart and struggled to breathe again. "I'm not fit for that oath. This day, this whole journey, shows I probably never was. I agreed to give the treasure to the man who destroyed our home. I just killed 2 men who were already down and then lost my wits during the fight. I'm not just a monster, I'm a coward." He turned his face away from Tobin as he felt the sobs coming again. "God will forgive the killing," Tobin said, grasping his shoulder. "You know him better than I do." "Your guilt is not just to shame you. It's one of the ways he calls to you." Tobin sighed and squeezed his shoulder again. "Turn to him, and you'll feel it eventually. But you must also forgive yourself." Kurian felt like that was something he could never do. "In the meantime," Tobin said, standing up and holding out his hand, "there is work to be done." He didn't believe Tobin, didn't think God would simply forget what he had done. The order had lost his favor for some reason, but he and his friends were still alive. Perhaps they could find a secluded place where he would ignore them and their faults. They might be able to hide the treasure where it would be safe and somehow lead quiet lives. The guilt was something he would have to figure out later. He grabbed Tobin's hand and stood up. Hopefully his friend would still want to join him in hiding. "Thanks for saving me," he said as they walked back together. Rhys and Noeman had already piled the corpses at one side of the grove and were covering them with leaves when Kurian followed Tobin back to the camp. Louise stood at the opposite side of the circle of trees, arms outstretched, trying to woo the guards' horses with apples. It looked like she had already had some success, since 2 of them stood beside Greta. "Welcome back," said Noeman when he saw them. He came over and gripped Kurian's shoulders, looking into his eyes with what seemed like genuine concern. It was the way his father had always comforted him when he was a child. It helped, even coming from the dean. I'm glad you're all right. Kurian had an urge to hug him, but he held back. The dean would not think it appropriate. Reese, on the other hand, grabbed Kurian in his thick arms and lifted him from the ground. We did it, he said with a crazy grin on his face. We survived our first real battle. He put Kurian down and slugged Tobin in the shoulder. And our little scholar has some tricks up his sleeves, eh? Now what do we do? Asked Kurian. We keep going, Tobin said. Only now we have extra supplies, which we needed after running into the dean. And we have horses. They can cut days off our traveling. Reese cleared his throat. I guess all that reading also made you a horse expert? Well, we can't just let them go, said Tobin. They'll go straight back to their stables, and Evasius will hear that his guards have disappeared. He'll guess that we made them disappear. But we can send Greta back home, and the innkeeper will know. Maybe he'll spread rumors that we have disappeared. Louise cocked an eyebrow and shook her head behind his back. Tricky, Reese said, wagging a finger at Tobin. He was still giddy from the fight. Kurian watched Louise grab a third horse's bridle and pointed so that the others would look. I think we brought the horse expert with us. They determined to stay another night in the grove. Since the threat of pursuit was gone for the moment, they lit a fire, and the boys sorted through their new supplies while Louise captured the remaining horses. Once she had convinced the leader's horse to trust her, the others came more easily. It was almost dark by the time she had gathered the last one. Riding lessons would wait until morning, when they had all rested. After a meal of roasted apples and bread from the guards' packs, Noeman stood up in the firelight. Miss Prescott, would you assist me with something, please? She nodded, and he turned to the boys, smiling. Boys, if you would, please hand Miss Prescott your belts and staves. Kurian's mouth dropped open. The dean couldn't be serious. Why? Tobin asked. Because after your determination in pursuing the retrieval of our treasure, and because of your courage and resourcefulness today, I know you are ready. Ready for what? Tobin said. He wants to ordain us, Kurian said, his voice flat. As smart as Tobin was, sometimes the obvious took a while to sink in, and this was obviously the easiest way for Noeman to take control of the situation and carry out his fantasy of rebuilding the order as it had been. I've been thinking, said Noeman, that to rebuild the order, we will need more than just one monk. He pointed to himself. And I would be happy to call you my brothers. I suppose you would happily be the abbot as well, Kurian said, crossing his arms. Of course he wanted to be in charge, after running away while the order burned. He may have made it through today's fight, but he ran when everything was at stake. Well, that seems like the most logical choice. I am the only one who has studied all the Order's subjects, as well as mastered the Guardian training. Though I could wait to take on that role until we have a new cloister. Don't you understand what's happening? The Order is gone. You said it yourself under the bridge. There's no going back. Kurian stood up from his seat by the fire to face the dean at the same level. The blacksmith, the abbot, our troop, even little Simon. Everyone we knew is dead. He felt tears welling up again and fought to keep control of his voice. He almost had to growl to get the rest out. There's no rebuilding while Evasius is still in power. We have to try, Noeman stuttered, looking surprised at Kurian's outburst. We took an oath. But there's no order to swear to anymore. We failed in our charge, and God forsook us. How dare you say such a thing? Noeman stepped forward as if he would strike him, but they were no longer in the classroom, and Kurian stood his ground. Kurian, stop, Tobin whispered next to him. He shook his head. Where have the great heroes been for the last century? Why didn't our brothers ever travel further than Apiford, and why were their missions only mercy visits? Had they collected all the ancient relics? Or did all the rules stop them from guiding the people of Pollingham? I've been outside the wall now, Dean. I've seen the way people live outside the influence of our little compound. Nobody respects God or listens to his servants. We had no power, and we let a tyrant like Evasius take control of the people's hearts and minds, while we cowered in fear of breaking the rule. The Caprics are dead, and it's because of men like you." He untied the cords from his waist and dropped them at Noeman's feet. "But I would be free of your rule." He spat on the red and white cords, then picked up a leather tie from the baggage and wrapped it around his waist. He knew how the dean would see it, a rejection not just of the offer of ordination, but of his original oath. The dean would see him choosing to be an ordinary person instead of taking the responsibility of their vestments. He waited long enough to be sure it had sunk in, and then stalked toward the emptiness of the plains. "What would you do instead?" Noeman asked. His face was red and his cheeks twitched. Kurian had never seen him so angry. "I'm going to get the treasure to fulfill that part of my oath. Then I will do whatever it takes to make sure Evasius never touches it. If God helps us pull off that miracle, then maybe we'll get a vision for what comes next." He wheeled around and walked beyond the trees into the darkness. When the glare of the fire no longer lit his back, he sat down and began tearing off the small tassels sewn into the hem of his robe. They were another sign of the order and the rule. The fifth abbot, Sage Capric, had authored the rule and designed what became the uniform of the monks of the treasure, as they were once called. After adopting the rule and making it the guide for every aspect of life at the order, the Caprics became a nickname that overtook the original. In his scheme, the white and red-colored tassels, much like the belts, were supposed to be a constant reminder of their dual oath to God and to the order, as well as their compound mission to protect the treasure and serve the people as spiritual guides. The red was a symbol that they had pledged their lifeblood to God and their brothers. The white signified their vow to be pure and blameless in all they did. He stopped tearing them off after remembering their meaning. The rule and its regulations might go overboard, but he could still do his best to fulfill those oaths to God and his brothers, to an upright life, even outside the order. The missing tassels could be his personal reminder that the rule was not the same as his promises. Eventually, he lay back on the springy turf and stared up at the blackness of the sky. He tried to block out the thoughts of all the chaos in which he found himself, the order burning, his friends and teachers dead, the fight with Fallon, and the battle that morning. As soon as he pushed out one terrible thought, another one entered his mind to fill his heart with despair. A soft breeze passed over him and chilled the wet streaks running down his face. He had been staring blindly at the unchanging black of the sky until the breeze brought his mind back to where he was. Slowly, he realized that he was looking at a pinpoint of white light in the sky. He had never seen anything like it in his life. It wasn't like the bright area in the clouds that showed where the sun was on lighter days, and it wasn't the similar glow that hinted at the moon. This was a small, shimmering point of light, like a candle seen in a distant window, only it was a pure, clear white. He propped himself up on his elbows and squinted. After staring for several moments, he thought he could see other, dimmer points of light near the first one. Suddenly, it occurred to him what it might be. During a series of lectures a couple years before, Noeman had shown them maps of pictures that he said were in the sky. He said they were made of points of light, and called the study of the pictures astronomy. Kurian wasn't sure he could believe his eyes. This was a star, the first one anyone might have seen for generations. "Are you planning on sleeping out here tonight?" Louise said behind him. Kurian jumped to his feet and wiped his face with his sleeves. "No, I was just—" He pointed toward the sky. "Did you see it?" "See what?" She looked up. He looked back to where the star had been, but it was gone, covered up by the clouds again. "Nothing," he said. Maybe he hadn't seen it. It might have been his imagination. Not that it meant anything if he had seen it. Such things were merely unexplainable weather. When he looked at Louise again, he thought he saw the same knowing look she had given him in the tavern. "Your friends are fully ordained now." Tobin was very eager, but Reese was more reluctant. It was a lovely ceremony. I suppose that leaves me out then, he said. He expected her to say something witty and biting, but for a while she said nothing. Do you want to talk about it? No, he said, and started walking back toward the grove with her. He could see the campfire glowing between the trees and wanted to be near his friends, but he also felt like holding back and being alone with Louise. She seemed to understand what was happening better than the rest of them, and he wanted to find out more. Not tonight, though. There would be plenty of time during their journey. But thank you for the offer, he said as they neared the trees. One orphan to another. Any time, she said softly. Well, Kurian and his friends came out victorious, but the victory only aggravated the challenges between Kurian and Noeman. Tensions are growing within this group. Whose plan is going to come out on top? That's a long answer. And what about that star that Kurian saw when Pollingham is constantly covered in gloom? Is it a reason for hope or a false sign? Or is Kurian just already too far down the path of despair for it to make a difference? Join me next Friday when the group enters the ruins of Finn. What dangers and secrets will they find as the treasure of Capric continues? In our Morsel of Wisdom segment this week, I wanted to share Proverbs 28:23, this time from the Holman translation. One who rebukes a person will later find more favor than one who flatters with his tongue. I find it oddly coincidental, and I say coincidental with air quotes, that I ran across this one in my reading this morning when I hadn't planned anything for this episode. It's been a theme throughout my life, and lately I've had some reminders again. And Kurian just gave Noeman a pretty good tongue lashing, but I wouldn't say all of his complaints were fairly aimed at Noeman, and he certainly wasn't speaking the truth in love. It's a concept that's been difficult as a lesson for me, but it's one that has borne out at some really important points in my life. Rebuke or correction just don't come naturally to my personality, and I'm definitely not the type of person to eagerly seek out conflict. It tends to tear my heart up when I have to tell somebody a hard truth, even if I'm convinced that it's the most loving thing for me to say. When I'm sure it's going to upset them, it's just really challenging. I'd say I've learned the lesson best working with teens, that while it's great to be buddies and be a friend, somebody who can listen and offer support, it's good to be a positive example of a faithful life. But if you back down on the hard truths when they need to hear it, you lose the opportunity to make a significant positive difference in their lives. It's the difference between being a buddy and a true friend, or more appropriately, when you're acting with somebody younger, a mentor. It's not something that has to come up every time you meet or with every person, but there are just moments when it's keenly important that you speak out, and it's keenly important for both your faith and often theirs. From a more natural perspective, I think this proverb touches on the concept of enabling destructive behavior. Many times in our discomfort, we'll turn a blind eye to something, or we'll overlook something that somebody's doing that might be harmful to them or to others. And some of us go so far as to praise or help the person doing something wrong, whether because we have this type of smothering love, or we have a fear that trying to stop that bad behavior will make the other person stop loving us. In that light, as an example, I've known parents who will, for instance, get a second mortgage to loan money to their adult child who has a gambling addiction. That's the very extreme type of enabling that we often see with things like addictive behavior. But there are subtler forms that can still be destructive and keep someone in a harmful cycle. In my opinion, I'd say that social media has supercharged a culture of enabling, where we always have to be positive cheerleaders for those people in our circle, regardless of whether we know the true impact of the decisions they're posting about. The ugly flip side of that coin is that folks feel free to rail against complete strangers who may be doing something they disagree with, and sometimes even the same things that their friends are doing that they're cheerleading. Social media has kind of made rebuke or correction verboten in our culture, even if it's truth spoken in love. Of course, I had to learn this lesson personally as a younger person myself. There were times when I didn't like the answers I was getting from good counselors. Many times my conscience knew it was right, but I just didn't want to listen. Maybe I'd be better today if I had followed that advice more often. I know for a fact it would have saved me from some rocky roads. Over the years, though, I've learned that, at least for me, maybe because it's so uncomfortable with my personality, when I feel the urge to speak a hard truth to a friend, a relative, or a younger person, it's often the Holy Spirit trying to use me to help. Now, the beauty of what God has done on more than one occasion is that because of my normally comforting personality, He often gives me a way to say it that flies under the radar of offense. It might technically be a rebuke, but I can often say it in a way that the person can hear it without getting so angry. And as I've exercised that courage to speak, He opens doors to strengthen those relationships and walk through the trouble together with that person, ultimately to make better disciples. That's a lot to say about a simple little proverb. I encourage you to chew on that morsel and seek out God's wisdom in applying it. One who rebukes a person will later find more favor than one who flatters with his tongue. That's it for this week. Thanks again for listening to Brandon Wilborn's Fantasy Fiction. Until next time, Godspeed. The Treasure of Capric is also available in print and ebook formats from all major booksellers. Find a link to your favorite retailer in the show description or go to brandonwilborn.com. That's brand on, not brand off, and Wilborn as simple as you can make it. Wilborn. This has been The Treasure of Capric, Book 1 of The King of the Caves, written and narrated by Brandon M. Wilborn. Copyright Brandon M. Wilborn.